Somewhere on an old tax roll, a baptismal register, or a ship's manifest, your surname was already choosing sides. Long before it sat quietly on a mailbox, it marked a province, a trade route, a loyalty, a war. The Dutch Golden Age was never one nation. It was 7 independent provinces, each with its own fleets, rebellions, and bloodlines fighting for survival. 10 surnames still carry that old map buried inside them. Say yours out loud right now. By the final name on this list, you will be standing face to face with the family that built the Dutch Republic. Number 10. De Vries. It looks like the most Dutch name imaginable, and it is. But the meaning is almost too simple to notice. De Vries means the Frisian, and that single word carries an entire lost world. Friesland was never fully conquered. Roman armies avoided it. Frankish kings struggled to hold it. The Frisians kept their own laws, their own language, and for centuries their own sea trade stretching from the Wadden coast into the Baltic, moving butter, cattle, and cloth through ports most outsiders never bothered to learn the names of. Old Frisian law codes and land charters still record families defending that independence long after neighboring regions bent the knee. When Dutch officials outside Friesland needed to mark someone as an outsider, they simply called him De Vries. The name was never a compliment inside Friesland. It was a label from the rest of the country. Frisian folk memory even preserved the legend of the Frisian freedom, a claimed exemption from feudal servitude that later scholars traced back to genuine medieval privileges, not just pride. That stubborn streak shows up again and again in how slowly Friesland integrated into wider Dutch institutions, keeping its own courts and customs well into the Golden Age itself. If this is your name, your family may not trace to a king, but to something the crown could never fully rule. That is the first door. The next name did not survive by resisting conquest. It survived by controlling the water everyone else needed. Number 9. Van Dam. Every Dutch schoolchild knows this word, and almost no one stops to ask what it actually cost. A dam was not decoration. It was survival technology, and the families who controlled the dams controlled trade, tolls, and safety itself in a country built below sea level. Van Dam marks a family tied to that engineered ground, most famously the dam on the Amstel that gave Amsterdam its name and its fortune. Land charters and city registers from the Golden Age repeatedly list dam-keeping families among the merchants who financed the fleets. This was not glamorous nobility, something arguably more powerful: quiet control over the exact point where a flooding country stayed dry. Guild records and city council minutes from Amsterdam's early expansion show dam-related families sitting on waterboards, the powerful local authorities that decided who got protected and who got flooded first when a storm surge hit. Most people never hear that part. If your family carried this name into passports and mailboxes, it once meant the difference between a city surviving a storm surge and a city disappearing beneath it. The next surname sounds like the sea itself, and for one province, it practically was the province. Number 8. Zeeman. The name means seaman, and in most countries that would just be an occupation. In the province of Zeeland, it was closer to a way of life carved directly onto tombstones. Zeeland sat exposed to storms, floods, and invasion from the open North Sea, and its families built their entire identity around ships, dikes, and salt water, burying their dead within sight of the very tides that could take everything away overnight. During the Golden Age, Zeeland ports like Middelburg and Vlissingen sent captains and crews into the Dutch East India Company and West India Company in numbers wildly disproportionate to the province's size. Ship records and company crew lists from that era are full of Zeeman entries, generation after generation, often whole families listed together on the same vessel manifests. Some Zeeland captains became legendary for privateering against Spanish and Portuguese shipping decades before the East India Company ever existed, turning small coastal towns into surprisingly wealthy ports almost overnight. The twist is darker than the adventure story suggests. Zeeland's fleets were tied directly into the slave trade routes of the West India Company, a brutal chapter often left out of the seafaring romance. If this name is yours, the old records point towards saltwater, storms, and a province that lived and profited by the sea in ways both bold and troubling. The next family did not sail toward danger. They built the crossing point armies were forced to use. Number 7. Ten Kate. This one hides its meaning almost on purpose. Ten Kate comes from Kate, an old regional word tied to farmsteads and small enclosed holdings in the eastern province of Overijssel. It does not sound noble, and it was not meant to. This was a landholding name, marking a family attached to a specific parcel of ground for generations, the kind of quiet rural power that rarely appears in royal chronicles but shows up constantly in tax rolls and local land registers. Overijssel sat on contested ground between competing bishoprics and duchies for centuries, and families who kept their land intact through those shifting borders were doing something harder than it looks. Local land registers from the region show the same farmstead names reappearing across generations of tax assessments, a quiet form of endurance that never needed a battlefield to prove itself. Later, some 10 Kate families became major textile merchants as the region industrialized, turning old farmland roots into golden age trading wealth. This is where the story turns quieter, but no less real. If this is your name, your bloodline was not fighting for a crown. It was holding ground while crowns changed hands around it. The next surname sounds foreign at first, but it became one of the most rooted names in the entire country. Number 6. Van Gelderen. The name points directly at Gelderland, once its own duchy, powerful enough to rival Holland itself before it was absorbed into the wider Dutch Union. Families carrying Van Gelderen were marked as coming out of that older, semi-independent territory, one with its own dukes, its own army, and its own long rivalry with the Counts of Holland. Regional chronicles describe Gelderland switching allegiances between the Habsburgs and the rebelling northern provinces more than once, before finally committing to the Dutch revolt. Border charters from the duchy even show Gelderland briefly allied with the Duchy of Cleves against Habsburg pressure, the kind of independent maneuvering a fully subject territory would never have attempted. That hesitation was not weakness. It was survival calculation by a border territory caught between empires. Families who carried the Gelderen name into the Golden Age were carrying the memory of a duchy that had once negotiated as an equal with Holland, not as a subject of it. Most people assume every Dutch province simply fell in line together. The land charters say otherwise. If this name is yours, your ancestors came from a territory that once had its own throne. The next name belonged to a province the rest of the country openly distrusted. Number 5. De Brabander. Say this one carefully, because it marks someone from Brabant, and Brabant was, for a long stretch of history, the wrong side of the religious and political line. While the northern provinces broke from Habsburg Spain and turned Protestant during the Dutch Revolt, much of Brabant stayed Catholic and remained under Spanish, then Austrian control. Families who moved north carrying the name de Brabander were often refugees from that split, Catholic merchants and craftsmen fleeing a border war that tore the Low Countries in half. Church registers and migration records from Amsterdam and Rotterdam show waves of Brabant surnames arriving throughout the late 16th century, bringing textile and diamond trade skills that helped fuel the Golden Age boom. Some of these migrant families arrived with almost nothing beyond specialized craft knowledge, yet within a generation their trades were feeding the same merchant economy that later celebrated the North's genius, while quietly forgetting where the skill had come from. The twist is that some of Amsterdam's Golden Age wealth was quietly built by southern refugees the North had once viewed with suspicion. If your family carries this name, your bloodline may have crossed a hardened religious border to survive and helped build the very economy that made the North famous. The next name comes from a province almost written out of the story entirely. Number 4. Drenthe. Most people cannot even place Drenthe on a map. And that is exactly the point. It was the poorest, most sparsely settled province in the Dutch Republic, so overlooked that it was governed almost like an afterthought, while Holland's cities grew rich off global trade. Families carrying the name Drenthe were marked as coming from this quiet, peat-covered interior, a region of ancient burial mounds and old agricultural communities largely untouched by the wars reshaping the coast. Regional records show Drenthe families surviving mostly outside the Golden Age gold rush, working peat, land, and small trade instead of overseas fleets. Some of the province's ancient burial mounds and communal peat rights date back to well before written Dutch history even begins, and local custom law continued to govern land use in Drenthe long after Roman-style legal codes had taken over elsewhere. Here is the twist. Drenthe's isolation meant many of its oldest customs, land laws, and community structures survived largely intact, while wealthier provinces were transformed by war and commerce. If this is your name, your bloodline may not connect to a merchant fortune, but to one of the most unbroken rural traditions in the entire country. The next surname belonged to a province that fought its own private war with the sea and nearly lost more than once. Number 3. Groninger. This name marks someone from Groningen, a province and city that spent much of its early history acting less like a loyal partner and more like an independent republic that happened to be geographically Dutch. Groningen ran its own trade networks into the Hanseatic League long before the Dutch Republic existed, and city charters show it negotiating with foreign powers almost as its own state. When it finally joined the rebelling provinces against Spain, it did so partly by force after a prolonged siege, not out of easy loyalty. Contemporary siege accounts describe the city holding out under harsh conditions before terms were finally settled. A reminder that unity in the Republic was often negotiated at the point of a cannon, not simply agreed upon around a table. Families carrying the Groninger name into later records were marked by that stubborn, semi-independent identity, and the region's grain trade helped feed the very cities that later overshadowed it in the history books. The twist most people miss is that Groningen, not Holland, was one of the earliest and toughest holdouts in the entire Northern Rebellion. If your family carries this name, your bloodline came from a province that essentially had to be conquered into joining the country that later claimed it. The next name belonged to the province that started the entire Dutch story before Holland ever took the spotlight. Number 2. Van Utrecht. Before Amsterdam, before Holland's merchant fleets ruled the seas, Utrecht was arguably the most powerful territory in the entire Low Countries, seat of a bishopric that once controlled land, taxation, and armed forces stretching across much of the modern Netherlands. Van Utrecht marks a family tied directly to that older center of power, a city whose bishop princes negotiated with emperors long before Holland's merchants existed as a political force. Church chronicles and imperial land charters describe Utrecht's bishops governing territory the way kings governed kingdoms, complete with their own soldiers and courts. For centuries, disputes between Utrecht and the counts of Holland were treated as conflicts between near-equal powers, not as a ruler settling a rebellious province, a dynamic almost impossible to imagine once Holland's Golden Age wealth eclipsed everything around it. The twist is that Utrecht's power collapsed almost entirely by the Golden Age, eclipsed by the very province, Holland, that had once been its junior neighbor. Families who carried the Utrecht name into the 17th century were carrying the memory of a fallen capital, not a rising one. If this is your surname, your bloodline traces back to the original center of power in the Low Countries, before that power quietly shifted north and west forever. Now we reach the name that changes the scale of everything. Number 1. Van Nassau. This is not just a provincial name, this is the family that built the Dutch Republic itself. Nassau originated as a German comital house, but through marriage and inheritance it became inseparably fused with the title Prince of Orange, producing William of Orange, the leader who turned scattered, rebelling provinces into a single nation fighting Habsburg Spain. Royal genealogies, treaties, and official state records from the Dutch Revolt place the House of Orange-Nassau at the center of nearly every major decision that created the Republic that would go on to dominate the Golden Age. William of Orange was assassinated for that role, shot in Delft by an agent loyal to Spain, and his death only accelerated the cause rather than ending it, a martyrdom that later chroniclers folded directly into the founding legend of the entire nation. This does not mean everyone carrying a Nassau-linked name today descends directly from William himself, but the surname tradition is tied unmistakably to the ruling house that shaped the entire framework the other 9 names on this list operated inside. Every province, every fleet, every merchant fortune existed within a country this family effectively willed into being through war and diplomacy. If this name touches your family history in any form, you are not connected to one province. You are connected to the house that decided there would be provinces worth fighting for at all. 10 surnames, 7 provinces, and 1 nation stitched together out of rebellion, trade, faith, and blood. These are not just labels people write on forms. They are compressed histories, carrying the memory of dikes that held back the sea, fleets that crossed oceans, churches that split a country in half, and a ruling house that gambled everything on independence. A name that looks plain on a school register once meant something different entirely, spoken aloud on a dock, carved into a church wall, or listed on a manifest bound for the other side of the world. Somewhere in your own name, a province is still speaking, a war is still echoing, a bloodline is still asking to be remembered. Comment your surname below, and tell us which province, which migration, or which forgotten name you want decoded next. This is not the last hidden map buried inside an ordinary name, and next time, we go looking for another one.